Hi, and welcome to our first video online discussion. I guess this would be more of a lecture since we're not talking back and forth. Today we're going to be learning about carbohydrates, and then I will post this on Canvas. So, carbohydrates. What is the function of carbohydrates? Why do we need them? To provide us energy. So you remember there are three energy systems. The first one uses ATP, that quick burst if you're jumping or you're throwing, you're doing a 1 rep max. And then the other two energy systems, the anaerobic system, also known as the glycolytic system, and the aerobic system, or the oxidative system, they are going to be using carbohydrates for energy. So remember, the oxidative system at the beginning uses more carbs than fats, and then as you are doing a longer duration exercise, it uses more fats than as energy. But essentially, carbs, or food, gets broken down into glucose, the simplest unit, and then it goes through these energy systems. So different types of carbohydrates. So there are simple carbs, complex carbs, fiber, and then within that there's insoluble and soluble fiber. So we'll talk about those in more detail as I continue with our slides. So carbs and sugars. So simple carbohydrates are simply sugars within our body. Complex carbohydrates is a longer strand of sugar plus a starch plus a fiber going through our body. That fiber allows it to go through our body much slower, so we're able to absorb the nutrients not right away all at one time. Sometimes that fiber goes through our body and unchanged through our system, but it's allowing things to be processed much slower. So how do you know if something is a carbohydrate? So looking at the back end of the word, the OSE, glucose, dextrose, fructose, galactose. Those are all carbohydrates. Where do these carbohydrates come from? Where are we getting them? What food sources are we getting carbohydrates from, and where do they grow from? What plant sources do we eat the majority of our carbs? Wheat. So maybe some of you are gluten-free, and if so, this is not what you eat, but any grain. This could be an example of a grain, a beautiful drawing, right? So there's the root, there's the stem, there's the head, a bunch of beards and kernels. If we take one up, we take that outer layer off, that husk off, and then we're left with the grain itself. So on the outer layer of that grain is the bran, which is the fiber, which is allowing us to slowly process the nutrients. If you take that off, then you're left with this white fluffy stuff. It's the refined white bread, white pasta, white fluffy, delicious tasting, but not a lot of nutrients, called the endosperm, white flour. And then inside of there, there's a small little piece called the germ, which is giving us a lot of nutrients. So I've got another picture that's going to make it bigger here. You can see the bran, that outer layer, the endosperm, the endosperm, and the germ. So if you're eating a whole grain, you are getting all three of those portions. So what does bran do? So bran has fiber. So again, we've talked a bit about fiber. It has a few vitamins. It has fiber, quite a lot of fiber. I've said that before. I'll keep saying that. It's got magnesium, but it doesn't have the majority of the vitamins, and it doesn't have that oil, that vitamin E here, coming from the germ. So then endosperm, what does this white fluffy stuff actually have? So it's refined. When you're consuming it, it's been refined and processed. It's not particularly great for us. It doesn't give us a lot of nutrients. It doesn't keep us full for very long, and you'll find it in anything that's kind of just white and fluffy, but it's what our brain usually desires to eat. Then here's the germ, this small part here. It's not good for shelf life because it has the fat in it, so vitamin E as well. It's lacking fiber coming from the bran, but when we eat them all together, we're getting the vitamins, we're getting the minerals, and then we're kind of getting the extra that puts it all together. So think back to our quiz on chapter 6. If you remember, we also talked about it in class a couple of months ago. So corn is technically a whole grain. So it has all of the parts of the grain. It hasn't been refined. However, our body treats it much more like white rice and other rapidly digested grains. Why does it do it if it's actually a whole grain itself? So it has, I don't know if you remember from our conversations, it has been so intensively bred for higher starch. Why? Because we desire sugary things. We are more drawn to sugary things. So a higher starch content that it no longer replicates the corn that our forefathers once consumed. So what does this all mean? So if you are going grocery shopping, which I know is pretty challenging right now, but still needs to happen, and right now we're kind of at the whim and mercy of what's available, but let's say in a normal world, if we were going grocery shopping and we had the choices of to make better choices, the option to make better choices, knowing the difference in what labels say. So what is the difference between enriched compared to fortified? So an enriched product, so here's a package of bread, and sometimes you'll see the first ingredient or any ingredients, maybe it's the third or fourth, it'll say enriched wheat flour. So that means that it was, something was taken out, it was refined, it was altered, and then some of the nutrients were put back in. I have a chart, maybe 10 slides down the road, that shows you an example of some of the ingredients that are taken out and then what's put back in, but what you're still missing. Compared then to the whole grain, which is all of those parts, but a lot of times you'll notice that it's not that first ingredient, and so you're not getting all of those parts. You're not getting as much fiber in that wheat germ as if you would if it were the first ingredients. Compare that then to fortified. So here's an example of something fortified. So that's adding an ingredient, adding a nutrient to a product that doesn't exist in its natural state. So a lot of times orange juice is fortified with calcium, or cereals are fortified with folate or B vitamins. So you're making a product more nutritious than it exists on its own. And some of that we'll talk about when we talk about vitamins, why, and some of it is USDA compliance, and some of it is to help to absorb the natural contents better. Types of wheat flour. So if you were to go to the store and you had lots of options for purchasing a bag of bread, and if you're gluten-free, you can buy a bag. Think about buying a bag of bread that's not wheat. It can be any other type of flour as well. If it says refined, so that means that you've removed some of the food products, you've removed that shaft, that outer layer, the bran and the germ, and you're just leaving the endosperm. So refined flour is generally white and fluffy and doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it, and is not going to keep you full for a very long time. Stone ground. If you see something that's stone ground, this is simply the process by which it was ground. So you still need to look for the word whole grain in it, but you just knowing that that's how they happen to grind up the grain that they're using. Unbleached flour. So this is that middle part, that endosperm, but the endosperm hasn't been bleached, and so it's by nature is kind of this beigeish color, and so it would have the same kind of non-nutritious qualities as something that's refined. Next, white flour. Same thing as before, but it has been bleached, so it is white and pretty, it is soft, it is kind of what our tongue sometimes desires to consume. Wheat flour. Now, wheat flour is often tricky because people say, oh, wheat flour, this must be really healthy, but it's missing the word whole. So this means that the flour came from wheat, but it's not telling you that it includes the that it includes the bran or the germ. So it essentially is the same as white flour. Enriched wheat flour. It's the same as above, except for the source of grain is not, again, identified. And so, this source is identified. This is from wheat. So you're taking out, you're refining it, and then you're enriching it. You're adding back. So all of these are vitamin Bs, but you're missing out some of the minerals during that processing and refining process. Whole wheat flour. So there's the first time I have an example with the word whole. So you're getting the grain or whole grain. You're getting the entire grain milled or stone ground, however it was milled and processed, and it's not refined. You're not missing out any of those portions of the actual grain in its entity. There are lots of gluten-free options as well. So if you are a gluten-free consumer, you still want to look for the word whole within that. Let's talk about gluten-free just for a moment. I know we talked about it in class a couple of months ago, but is gluten-free healthier? Can it be healthier? Can it potentially be less healthy? So if you have celiac, then you for sure should not be consuming gluten. But if you feel like you feel better when you're not eating gluten, think about what you're substituting that gluten for. So gluten-free movement started as a way to eat less processed foods. So eating more whole foods, eating more foods that are on the external perimeter of the grocery store. But nowadays it's so popular that it's kind of this processed food gluten-free movement where you can get gluten-free bagels, cakes, donuts, pasta, anything, right? But what is gluten? If we're taking out the gluten is the binding thing. It's like the glue that holds the flour together. So if you're taking that glue that holds the flour together, that's keeping this bread or whatever you're creating, you have to replace it with something to keep all of your whatever's in the bowl, whatever you're mixing together. So a lot of times it's replaced with extra sugar or extra fats to get the food to stick together in the absence of gluten. So a gluten-free diet is great if you're eating more fruits and vegetables and other whole grains rather than simply taking gluten out, adding sugars and fats, and then eating a gluten-free muffin and saying, oh, this is so healthy because it's gluten-free. Well, but in reality, you're adding maybe potentially more sugars and fats to your diet. So here's a picture of an artery. Here's a normal artery. Here's inflammation, fat, fibrous plaque. So kind of showing you the process of inflammation. So why should we look for whole grain rather than just the refined grain? So the word atherosclerosis is the hardening of arteries. So go ahead and write that down. I'll put that on your exam, the hardening of arteries. If we were in class together, I would have two people come up and act as examples, and I would have them roll up their sleeve, and I would give them a piece of sandpaper, and I would say, okay, for 5 minutes, I want you to use the sandpaper on your forearm. So all of you, roll up one sleeve, and you don't have sandpaper in your hand, and you probably wouldn't want to do that anyway, but rub your arm back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. If you did this for 5 or 10 minutes, what would happen? It would become red, it would become inflamed, it might become raised. If you did it for longer, it might start to bleed, right? So when we're consuming just the endosperm, we're consuming something where the vitamins and natural vitamins and minerals have been extracted. And why is this happening? It's happening because it gives the bread a longer shelf life. It gives it a finer texture. It prevents bugs from eating it. If a bug tries to just live off of white bread, it would die because there's not enough nutrients in it. So when the bran and the germ are removed, our body absorbs wheat differently. Instead of being a slow, steady process through which we're getting steady bursts of energy, our body breaks down the enriched flour too quickly, flooding the bloodstream with too much sugar at one time. So our body then has to work hard to absorb the excess sugars and then it stores it as fat. So this causes quick highs and lows in our blood sugar levels, which can lead to type 2 diabetes and to carrying excess weight. And then we're also not getting the proper nutrients that we could. So the inflammation here, if we're constantly eating sugars that are rapidly digested, it is causing inflammation, and then the cholesterol that we need, remember we need cholesterol, isn't able to go through our body and do the things that it needs to do. So then we're accumulating cholesterol in the walls of the blood vessels and such, and that can cause heart disease. So if you are into research on nutrition and you've read a lot about animal fats and saturated fats, and they say it's fine to eat them, there's usually the caveat there, it's fine to eat them if you're not consuming a lot of refined foods and a lot of sugars, because that inflammation then will cause all of the cholesterol that you're consuming to be trapped, which can then lead to problems later on in life. So be cautious with the types of sugars that you're consuming. Be cautious with the type of carbohydrates that you're consuming, you want them to be whole grains so that you're not causing inflammation there, which then can trap the cholesterol, which then can lead to atherosclerosis. Okay, here's a picture like I showed before, showing you whole grains, the nutrients that you're getting, showing you enriched, and showing you unenriched. So the blue one would be like white bread. The yellow one would be something that's been refined, and then they've re-added some of the nutrients, but they're losing some of the nutrients in that process. Okay, what does Dr. Walter Willett say when we eat a lot of white carbohydrates and we're lacking in fiber? So this is a review from the chapter that you recently read. There was a study with 65,000 women, and they said this was independent of their weight, exercise level, or family history. But these women who consumed a lot of high carbohydrates from white bread, potatoes, white rice, pasta, had a big increase in the risk for type 2 diabetes compared to those who are eating higher fiber foods like whole. So the word whole is really important. Whole grain, whole wheat when consuming it and looking for carbs. Okay. So white bread and potatoes, this is according to Dr. Walter Willett from what you read, he would like them to be moved up to the sweets category because they're metabolically the same. So there's a section in this chapter about glycemic index and glycemic load. So glycemic index is how quickly it makes your blood sugar spike. Foods with a high glycemic index give you that quick energy boost, but then also a quick drop in blood sugar. Results then in early return of hunger. Glycemic load is similar. It's the amount of carbs multiplied by the glycemic index. So carrots have a high glycemic index, but they have few carbs. So it's taking into account the amount of fiber. So the amount of fiber will slow down the spike of your rise in blood sugar. Sorry, I should have clicked in that quicker. So yeah, recap. Low fiber carbs are very similar to sugar because they're driving your blood sugar up too quickly. Whereas if you're eating something with more fiber in it, your blood sugar levels are going to rise in a much more safe way. So the two types of fiber, and then we will be done with this particular video. So soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Both are important in health. It's not important to necessarily know the difference, but just know that there are two different types. They aid in digestion. They help reduce the risk of developing heart disease, diabetes, obesity. You can look up those things. Constipation. Constipation is a big one. They're helping to get things out of your body quicker and easier and without you're adding roughage to your diet. And then they keep you full for longer. So a low fiber starch behaves like sugar. So this was from the 2 slides ago. It's going to increase your blood sugar faster. So examples of insoluble fiber and soluble fiber. There we go. So you can see pretty similar, right? And so fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, whole foods have lots of fiber in them. So then what do they actually do? So insoluble fiber helps to get things out of our body so that they're not staying in our body too much. It's preventing constipation, it's removing bad things, it's preventing then colon cancer. Soluble fiber binds with fatty acids. It helps to lower our LDLs, which is your in quotes bad cholesterol, regulating our blood sugar, and then it's allowing you to stay fuller for longer. It's not important to know the difference between the two, but it's important to know that they are coming from whole foods. They're coming from things that are good and that are helpful for us in preventing colon cancer, in preventing us from consuming more food than we really need to, and whatnot. So benefits of fiber. So reducing risk of colon cancer, getting things out quicker, adding bulk to our poo so we're not causing inflammation in our passageway as it's getting out there. It's getting out in an easier way. It's not causing inflammation in our veins and down in your colon and rectum because of that extra straining and pushing. And so it's great to be consuming things that are higher in fiber. Promoting feelings of fullness, preventing constipation, hemorrhoids. Females, if somebody have a baby, hemorrhoids are a thing that can happen during or after a pregnancy. And we'll stop here, and then we will continue on another one.